Hello, and welcome to the third of our spring 2022 Kessler Conversations on the topic Women in the Reformation. My name is Bo Adams, and I have the privilege of serving as director of Pitt's Theology Library here at Emory University, the home of the Richard C. Kessler Reformation Collection. Through our two conversations so far this semester, we've highlighted the import and often untold stories of 16th century women and their roles as theologians, asking what lessons we may learn in the 21st century from new historical investigation into the 16th century. Such an emphasis on bringing the past forward has always been at the center of programming around the rare book and manuscript collections that we call the Kessler Collection. I'm thrilled today to cap off our spring series with the scholar who quite literally wrote the book and edited the book on women and the Reformation. Reverend Dr. Kirsi Stjerna serves as the first Lutheran Los Angeles Southwest California Synod professor of Lutheran History and Theology at Pacific Lutheran Theological Seminary in Berkeley, which is by far the longest job title I have ever heard. She's also part of the core doctoral faculty at the Graduate Theological Union and a docent on the theological faculty at the University of Helsinki in her native Finland. She serves in leadership roles in almost all areas of Reformation Studies and Lutheran theology, including on the editorial board of journals like Lutheran Quarterly, Dialogue, and Swedish Theological Quarterly. And she's currently the co-chair of the committee that is hosting the quadrennial International Congress for Luther Research this August, which I'm proud to say the Kessler Collection is a sponsor for. In addition to being a top scholar and teacher, she's an ordained pastor in the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America and the Evangelical Lutheran Church in Finland, and she's served churches and the denomination literally around the world. Amongst her very long list of publications, I want to highlight a couple that I think are relevant to our time today. Her well-received 2008 book, Women in the Reformation, published with Wiley, has been read now by almost a generation of undergraduate and seminary students as an effective introduction to work of the 16th century women and their contributions to reform. Just last year, 2021, she published Lutheran Theology, A Grammar of Faith with Bloomsbury, a book that I believe will also become a standard textbook for seminary students. And finally, and most exciting for me, later this year, she will publish a major work on women in the Reformation that she has been editing for some time now, which includes 33 scholars addressing our topic from a wide variety of perspectives. And I want to frame our conversation today around this book, so I'll invite her in a second to tell us a little bit more about this project. Now, from this introduction, you can imagine there really is no one more qualified to wrap up this spring series. And so I'm so honored that she is joining us today. Professor Stjerna, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us.
Thank you, Dr. Adams. It's a pleasure to be here and very happy to know that there are several old and new friends present here in the webinar this morning or noon if you're in the East Coast.
Absolutely.
Yeah, thank you for letting me talk about the book. I hope it finds its way to different spaces. I hope it's not going to be too heavy. It got quite big with over 40 chapters. It's going to be heavyish, but I really hope it finds its way to different spaces and to a broader audience. While when we were writing the book with 33 contributors, we were thinking of the classroom and our research colleagues. With lots of new detail coming in one volume. So we had to think that who do we imagine is going to pick up this book? So anybody, but particularly classrooms and our scholar friends who will find a lot of new detail under these covers, in these covers. So the book, if I may now take a couple of minutes to talk about it.
Absolutely.
So we are not introducing, but we are featuring women from different parts of Europe. Biographical chapters that are shortest with recommended readings, with text samples, first-hand texts from 16th century women, with sometimes brand new translation. So this makes the book very unique, that you get to not only learn about the woman, but also read her words, and sometimes in brand new translation. And then we have contextualizing thematic articles between the biographical chapters. Looking at women in work, marriage in the 16th century, what do we learn from portraits of women, etc., etc. It's very kind of neat way to combine different approaches to the material, which is another unique feature of this book, is that our authors, it's an international bunch. We have people from all over the world writing, well, let's say Europe and US. And And everybody brings their own expertise. Some are more interested in language, some are more interested in cultural history, some are experts in English Reformation, some are experts in what happened with the Swiss women. And we have gender scholars, theologians, historians. All these people bring a very different approach, and that was allowed. We wanted authors to be able to write with their forte and expertise in mind. And so that makes a very, very rich resource that one can use in pieces or as a whole. And I think what we are proving with the work is that how important it is to dare to ask new questions and collaborate with new friends. Theologians can work with historians. Historians can work with art people. It is possible, but there needs to be some way to communicate and agree on what do we consider important. Whose voice matters? What is important to include? What material, what sources, and negotiate that. And that way we are bringing scholarship forward, not just in one discipline, but in several, because of the interdisciplinary nature of this work.
So I was going to ask if I could. Oh, go ahead. I was going to ask if you could place this kind of contextually within Reformation studies. Why now? What's been happening for the last few decades that makes this an important book for now?
For Reformation studies, where to start? Well, one is because all chapters apply one way or the other gender perspectives, broadly understood, it makes a point that we can no longer teach Reformation or write about Reformation without considering what was the role and impact of women, and without placing women at the center of each story, whether it's Reformation in France or Reformation in Nordic countries, or when we assess what happened with the Protestant theologies, who received them and how, and who said no thank you. A big surprise. Not every woman ran and said, yeah, I want to be Lutheran or with Calvin. And so because that, including women, it allows us to get a more complete story of what happened. We will never know for sure, but this is an ongoing work. But rewriting the narratives, rewriting the textbooks, and also then allowing us not only to learn more data, like there were more partners in reforms than the usual suspects, but also then to take another look at the theologies. What worked then that might have give us something relevant to think about today. What is still important about the different Protestant theologies? The women give us a different reality check. And also, I must say, with my students, we discovered when the women enter the room, Reformation studies just get really, really exciting. It's like we have new questions. There's a freedom to ask new questions. There's a freedom to challenge and critique and be inspired by different characters who were extremely brave in their confessing the faith. And that I do need to add here immediately so I don't forget. The book features women of the Reformation as not just receivers or the mothers, which is a huge role in itself, but as confessors of faith. Each woman in the book, one way or the other, confessed their faith, whether it was Anne Askew who died and left her record of what happened to her before that, or whether it was Elizabeth from Braunschweig who faced exile and gave up her freedoms in order to make sure the Lutheran faith is implemented. I could tell stories, but yeah, the recognizing women as confessors of faith immediately elevates them to the theological space, where we're talking about people taking stand on theological grounds, women as theologians. And the book features quite a few who wrote explicitly theology, but also theologized with using different genres like letters or hymn, etc.
Yeah, I want to put a pin in that question of what is theology, because I think we're going to return to that in a second. Before, though, you and I were speaking in advance of this, and you told me some stories about deciding on a title and a cover image for the book. And those conversations, for me, were illuminating about how there are different ways to approach this topic. So can you share with us what it's going to be called and how you got to that point?
Yeah, so the final topic, the final title for the book is Women Reformers in the Early Modern Europe. Women reformers, claiming that title for women instead of thinking that reformer has to be Martin Luther or Zwingli, who left such a record of writing. No, women reformers, broadly understood, in early modern Europe, which tells us what period and space we're talking about. Profiles, contexts, and texts. So we have biographical introductions, more than introductions, interpretations, really, and contextualizing articles and those text samples that are short, but hopefully make every reader excited and immediately find more. Which there's we can maybe return to this later, that there are more sources available now to follow these leads than was the case when I started decades ago. I didn't even know where to go. I found my way to Wolfenbüttel, but the book gives you maps where to go and find more of these primary sources. The cover, like what kind of cover would you put on a book that features so many women, some of whom we have no images, like Argola von Grumba, Catherine Giselle, Marie Dantier, the illustrious, productive writers? We don't have images of them. So we settled, after some heavy and illuminating discussions, on a cover that is red. It gets your attention, red velvet with jewels, which doesn't mean that every woman featured in the book had jewels, but the jewels and the velvet, a woman without a face, but featuring her hands. Women as agents of the Reformation, women's hands on the Reformation. And the color and the jewelry, the people who understand art more could talk about the symbolism of that, and how we can talk about power. How is power and involvement expressed? So that is going to be the cover. There's no one face, not many faces. And it is actually from a portrait of Catherine Parr, who was the surviving wife of Henry VIII. And so it's a very stunning cover, and hopefully makes one grab the book.
We're very much looking forward to it. In October, right? It's going to come out in October.
Early October, yeah.
So I'm curious, you've mentioned, and you said before that there are more sources available than when you started your study. And so I guess two questions here. One is there's been an increased interest in women in the Reformation. And I don't have to tell you that. You've been driving much of that interest. And so how can you place this book within that broader developing realm of scholarship? And then a second question is about those sources. How is it that we have more sources? Where have these things come from?
Yeah, maybe I start with my own journey a little bit, because that's a very wonderful question. When I was interested in women and Reformation, or women and Luther, or feminism and gender and Reformation studies in the 1980s, I didn't have even the right questions to ask. All I know, I was interested that how about women? And my wonderful advisors, both in Helsinki and Boston, recognized that you are onto something. We just don't know how to go about that. We were not trained with that methodology. We don't know what sources are out there. So why don't you go and look and then come back? That was back in Finland and then in Boston. Well, I never went back to Finland, but I had this pleasure of working in North America, where gender studies was more advanced than in Finland in 1980s. And it was allowed to ask questions about gender and women. It was allowed. There was a welcome to that. It was a lonely road, at least for me, but I don't think I was the only one to whom it has been a somewhat lonely road in defending that passion, that this actually matters. That even though it might promise a more glorious career to become an expert in Luther's commentary on Galatians, but my passion was, I want to know more. I really am interested in women. And that was part of my feminist awakening. So finding the sources came after I was able to develop arguments for why this is important and I should get funding. And who do I talk to? I talk to historians, cultural historians, social historians, while I'm a theologian myself. So there was a bit of a clash for me personally, but I don't think I'm the only one. Like, how do I even go about that? Because there was no model for me how to do that. Did I make many mistakes? Am I making many mistakes? Yes, but I'm having a lot of fun while doing that. But I learned about this clash between how traditional theology was taught and applied, and I learned the systematic analysis really well. But how to apply that method when you encounter a text, for instance, Argyle von Grumpa's letter? How do I apply a systematic analysis that works for studying a theological treatise written in a certain way to a letter that, how do I even know it's the right date, and how do I read this material? Now, 2022, we are in a good position that so many individuals and cohorts have done this work. And I thank specifically historians and social historians who have led the way so that theologians can join the fun. Because without the work of historians who have identified letters, who have dated the letters, who have proved the material and brought them available to us, then a theologian can do their work and analyze, for instance, which is my interest, what does Argyle von Grumpa think of God? How does she read the Bible? What is her method? How did she read about Mary compared to, let's say, Mary Dantier? Can I find sources that allow me to do analysis of the theology of these two women? We are not there yet. That work is coming thanks to the pioneering groundwork and sometimes very lonely work of people who have gone and found to the archives and know what to look for in the archives and bring it to those who don't have that training but who can analyze the content, if that makes sense. So now we have digitalized, the digitalization is in process. Also, many women's works are being printed in English and in translation, critical edition. Like Dr. McKee's work on Catherine Chazelle is a prime example what has needed to happen. Tell the story, get the data, critical edition, then translation, and then people can take that work and use it for their work. University of Chicago has been producing the Other Voice series of women authors, which is a wonderful resource. And the digitalization that happens throughout the world gives us those clues where to go to. But I think we're going to return to this question maybe later, but nothing compares the experience of being in a library where you can smell the source you're studying. And can I tell a story about Argyle von Grumpa?
You can absolutely tell a story if it involves how important libraries are, for sure.
Yes. So as I was teaching in Gettysburg in early 2000s, and my students were really interested in women and Reformation. And I thought, good, because I've been interested, but I never really didn't know how to go about that. So my students gave me inspiration enough to apply for grants so I could go to Northern European libraries, Wolfenbüttel in particular, familiar to many 16th century scholars, to find something. And I expected that I could come home with a little booklet of a couple of women did this and that. And I had one clue to look for Argyle von Grumpa's letter to so-and-so. And I'm sitting in a library and I keep writing the little paper card that I would like to get this letter. And I get receiving this book. I had to put my gloves on. You have to wear gloves so you don't smear the pages. And I get this wonderful leather-bound book that had text from Melanchthon and Luther and Olga Lampadius, all the heavy hitters. I kept sending it back. I said, no, I'm looking for Argyle von Grumpa's letter. After a few times the book came back to me, I decided to open it more. And I found that Argula's letter was part of that collection. So I felt fooled, first of all, that how come I did not know that? How come I had to live to be, I don't know how old I was then, to realize that Argyle von Grumpa, a 16th century woman, was one of the most published lay authors of the time, and that she was read by the same people who read Melanchthon and Calvin and Occam. Like what happened that this was lost on me? But it also taught me that like somebody hadn't given me the clue where to find that letter, I don't know where I would have gone. Now it's easier. You Google Argyle and you have many hits. But also the experience of, how would I say that? The important, what we have lost when we have forgotten the mothers of the Reformation, the women theologians who were there way before the feminist movement began for us. Yeah. They were there. Argyle, Marie Dantier, Catherine Chazelle, who in their own way defended the right of women to read the Bible, to teach, to theologize, and they have a whole lot to say about God and spirituality. And for many Protestant, I would say, for many Protestant traditions that currently suffer a little bit of lack of participation, churches are emptying. Like, what are we not offering? I'm a Lutheran, that some other denominations are. I think it boils down to this question of spirituality. We ignore those teachers who wrote to common people with the language of people, language of faith that was practiced at the home, in those private relations, and we have relied too much on the school theology. That it's wonderful. I get a big kick out of that, but I'm a professional theologian. But how about my mother? How about my sister? How about my children? So who is interpreting that? And these Reformation mothers were often, whether they had children or not, they often called themselves mothers, claiming that title for themselves with theological grounds. They interpreted that and they implemented that. And they had a spirituality that we can learn from, which is another stimulus to look into these women.
Yeah.
If you're not interested in history, who is not interested in spirituality?
Yeah.
We all breathe.
Well, and I want to highlight something that I think you've said, which is really important. It's really a question of what kinds of sources, because oftentimes someone like me will think about, oh, I'm looking for theology, therefore I'll look for Calvin's Institutes or a work that is explicitly theological.
Yeah.
But I think what's so important about some of the work that you and your colleagues have done has been to discover theology in a range of outputs. And you've mentioned letters, but I imagine we talked with Mary Jane Hamig about Elizabeth Kruziger as a hymn writer, and that is a theological act. So have you discovered theology, I would say, in all kinds of genre?
Well, I personally have read letters and like Gisèle's treatises, interpretation of the Bible, letters of consolation. When we talk about woman's letter, we could actually rename that in some cases a treatise. Mm-hmm. When Marie Dantier writes to Margaret de Navarre a letter, it's not a tiny little letter, it's a treatise. So the word letter is a word we use now, for the lack of a better term, for where do we find the source, but we really should probably more amply name them as treatises if you want to. I'm glad you mentioned Dr. Hamig's work on Elizabeth Kruziger. I mean, what a sin that so long people were singing the hymn and didn't know who actually wrote that. And any musician or poet would know, or an artist, how much you express theology through sounds, through poetry, to art. It's not limited to writing a Summa Theologica. We could think of Johann Sebastian Bach. Is there any more powerful theologian than Johann Sebastian Bach? And that's another, I hope somebody picks up this and follows this lead, looking at women and music, or women, men, and music as a way to look at lay theology. Because when we look beyond the so-called school theology and thinking how late a development it was that women were able to go to school and study, unless you were a convent woman or a noble woman with your private tutor, you really didn't have a lot of chances for education, even though Reformation implemented the seeds of public education, which is wonderful, but it would take a long time before women were allowed to study at the university, and that way entered the big games. So that's all great. Now women are part of that, but I can say as a woman, it still is a little bit of a rocky road being a woman in a field that has been so male dominated. And my way of theologizing might be a little bit different, maybe from one of my male colleagues, and that's okay. I can take it. I'm almost 60, but my own experience has been how difficult it is to try to theologize in ways that doesn't quite fit the mold. And so these Reformation mothers, I feel great affinity with them. Is that the word, affinity? Mm-hmm. Realizing what struggles they had. I mean, holy cow, in 16th century, you are writing theology. You were not even allowed to write theology. That really wasn't expected from women because you don't have the credentials. And they did it anyway as lay theologians. Why did they do that? What empowered them? I think their own spiritual experience and their care for others. It's very evident that many of the women who wrote, they did that regardless, or acted regardless of the regulations, because they cared passionately about the well-being of the other. And very importantly, they knew their Bible. That really empowered. Like, I may not have my PhD, I may not be ordained, but I know my Bible. And is it that part of the Protestant teaching that once you have access to the scripture, the priesthood of all believers, the inclusive grace of the gospel, I have all the right to read the Bible as you do. But Yeah, theory is sometimes different from practice.
Yeah.
So there's a very long way to answer that. The value of lay theology, it is, if we don't get on that now, when then? Because if we only go with school theology, and I use that word maybe not very nicely here, I don't know what's the future of Christianity in terms of faith. And we can study Christianity as a subject of our study. But if you talk about living faith, as it is for many of us, then lay theology needs to have a place there. And these women reformers model that and give us a stimulus to that. Let's do better today than has been done in the before. That who are we including in the room of conversation?
I think I want to pick up on that because I think that's so important. I mean, it's one of the reasons we do these conversations, right? Is to show that there is value. So you've identified yourself a number of times as a theologian rather than a historian, and so particularly in the context in which you teach, I presume part of your job is to draw lessons for the contemporary church out of these historical documents.
Yeah.
So if I could ask it in a very crass way, why should contemporary Christians or Protestants, or however we want to say that, why should they care about these women? I understand it's interesting and important to recover their work from the 16th century, but what do we learn about being church today from some of these women and from the method that you're having to apply to discover them?
Yeah, one does not need to be a historian to be interested in this. And I could use an example. I teach in Berkeley in a graduate theological union. We have several theological schools and religious centers, and I come from the Lutheran school. And when I offer a course called Women and Reformation, I make a little sketching of head, like, why on earth would I take that when I can study all these exciting topics? And those students who have taken the class, they come out of that, whether they're Christian or Lutheran or whatever, that doesn't matter. Like, oh my goodness, studying, having this kind of microscopic look at one piece of religious history, taking to the forefront the voices that were marginalized, the voices who didn't seem to belong but claimed that right for them, the courage of the individuals and the challenges they faced, recognizing the impact of human regulations versus how we understand theology and how theology is applied in human life, and the impact of gender, our sexual identity, orientation, all that, how these women faced injustice or dealt with justice issues, how they cared for their neighbor, how they tried to connect faith and practice. It almost like the centuries between us and them disappear, and we are in a space with these fascinating individuals who are like us. And I see it being very stimulating for students and for me in terms of how do I study in different ways with different questions, but not just to study, but how do I express my faith in new ways, and really the experience of empowerment and excitement about how religion does matter. And if it doesn't matter in what happens in daily life, then it can be just a subject of study. In a classroom, I see great excitement, not just that suddenly everybody becomes a Reformation scholar. Some do swap. They actually begin to study Reformation studies because they find with these women a new excitement of being in a cutting edge of rewriting narratives. Rewriting the history of Reformation in France, actually including Jeanne d'Albret and her mother Marguerite. I don't still understand how it's possible we have stories of French Reformation without including these leaders. But then taking to the life of the church, for instance, I get quite a few invitations to go to talk about this at churches, tomorrow, for instance. And whenever I do, the excitement is palpable. The excitement is palpable. It's almost like I am rediscovering or discovering for the first time the mothers of faith. It's like you have a family album and you never saw women there. And suddenly you learn about Aunt Hilda. And like, wow, how come I did not know that? We had a similar experience with the medieval women. That interest in medieval women came first, and Reformation women have come after that. And that's actually, I wrote my dissertation on Brigitta of Sweden because she wrote in Latin treatises that looked like what the guys wrote. Mm-hmm. And it was in the 80s and 90s, there was a great boom in studying the medieval women as teachers of faith, the mystics. And that's still going, that boom. And what I saw the draw there was that the experienced faith the power of teaching spirituality. Lay women, well, most of them are actually convent women, so I don't want to call them lay women. They had a vocation, a professional vocation at the church, but that was really the stimulus for many, and the authorizations to study the women, that they had something to say about faith that they experienced. But then, if I want to continue this a little bit, when looking at the 16th century women, my first mistake was to believe the so-called evidence that after the mystics disappeared, because there was no calling for them from the Protestant pulpits, like after Luther and Zwingli and Calvin and them preached, it seemed like for women there was no need to go to convent. You could be a happy mother and wife. Well, not every woman wants to do that, and for many a convent option was a wonderful option. So it seemed like suddenly there are this office for women as a public teacher of faith disappeared, and they didn't write, because we were looking for those visions and kind of genres that the medieval women used, and their authorization to talk theology was, God made me do it. God gave me an experience. I can't help it, even though I'm a woman. Even mighty Hildegard excused herself. I can't help it because God is making me to do that, giving me these visions that are so powerful. I have to preach and teach. Reformation women couldn't claim that, because that experience was out, other than if you were an Anabaptist. In those circles, it was still okay and invited to experience the Spirit. So for the Reformation women, the authorization to preach was, now you study your scripture and make your arguments and claim your voice with the scripture. I forgot your question.
No. I think you hit it exactly. I mean, again, I think the important point is, even though theology is happening in all of these different ways, theology is still happening. And I think that point you just made about a shift from the kind of mystical experience toward the kind of study of the scriptures is, of course, reflective of part of the change of the Reformation. But there's still theology happening across that. And so I think that's really what's so helpful about studying these women. I'm curious, you've mentioned kind of moving forward with the scholarship, and what are your hopes as you and your colleagues have done this hard work to, in many ways, uncover and retell some of these stories? Where do we go from here? What does the next generation of scholarship do to kind of stand on your shoulders and move the conversation forward?
It's the work I wanted to do, but there wasn't enough to work with, namely study this women's theology. Really analyze deeply how women understood and expressed their faith, and study that as study them as our theological teachers, mothers, voices. In order to do that, we had to come to a place when we have sources available also in English. Not everybody works with different languages, and I think that is okay. And that has been one of the obstacles. For instance, generally speaking, in Luther studies or Reformation studies, my students sometimes ask that, how many languages do I need to know in order to be relevant? And I would say we are in a world today that it kind of depends what you want to do, and if you have good bricks to build on from work of those who do know the languages, then you have all the right to dive in and study the theology of these women. That don't let the language be an obstacle. Mm-hmm. And it's easy for Europeans to say that we have to study different languages because we are not born speaking English unless we're British Islands. But that's kind of where we are. And also in Luther studies, this yeah, actually, I want to mention a resource on that later. But yeah, so really dive into the theology, and I think we have enough now mapping of who, where, and keep digging deeper. Yes, so study the theology of the women from whom we already have sources available, but then find those opportunities to go to the libraries and spend time there and just keep digging. You might make a discovery. Like recently, Dr. Amy Burnett Nelson and I, we were talking about Margaret Pruss, who printed Reformation materials, including Anabaptist material and Catherine Zell's work. And we were looking at this obscure German text, and we found accidentally, like, oh my goodness, there was another woman printer, Catherine Schurer, a widow who continued to print in her house after widow. That kind of like by chance, as we were reading this one page, like, oh my goodness. And actually Amy noticed that first, and it was like, you make these discoveries. And I have spent so much time in libraries in Europe, particularly in Rome, and Library of Congress, just spending time looking and having some clues, but just spending time and looking, and the whole experience is wonderful and mystical, but you sometimes make a really good discovery. So find those opportunities, find somebody who supports your crazy vision, and get funding, and go to libraries and dig deep. And you will find characters that were lost. There's a lot of work done now by on Anabaptist women, for instance, and the book has a couple of chapters on that, women on whom most of us knew nothing about, and but it takes somebody with commitment to go and dig deep, and then the kind of work is needed also where we take these women's sources and make bold theological claims. If you think this woman writes as a theologian, name her as one.
Mm-hmm.
Name her as one. I think it's really helpful, and that has been my curse and blessing also, that I dance both the theological tango and the historical hip hop. I'm both, and in the middle I'm a feminist. And I created my own methodology by my passions and with the support of wonderful teachers and colleagues. But I do think it's important to find a cohort and a group of scholars who critique you and keep you honest, but also support your work. And so the value of interdisciplinary conversations, I think we can thank feminist scholarship, and with feminists I mean women-centered scholarship and gender studies, for the progress we have made in how we write history today and how do we do theology today.
Yeah.
And we are not there yet. The struggles are very real. The question being whose voice matters, whose method matters, what source is valuable, what kind of questions are valuable. In about 1990s, early 2000s, I was asked to say something about Katarina Mambora. And I really don't know why I was asked, because I didn't know anything about her. and as I was preparing this presentation, it was a celebration of the joint declaration between Lutherans and Catholics. Mm-hmm. And I remember I spent most of my time arguing, why do we even care? Like, what is the point of caring about somebody like Katarina Mambora? And that whole spending time of arguing why this matters, it led me to do more. But that's something that every scholar who focuses on women needs to figure out. How do you argue for the value of what you do? And I hope that we have done enough legwork that it's easier for you than it was for us when we spend most of our time saying, yes, it can. Yes, it is.
Well, and to highlight one thing you mentioned there, the collaborative piece is so important. I think when people see the book, one of the things that's astounding is not only the diversity geographically, that the scholars contributing to the book are from all over, as you say, Europe and North America, but methodologically. I mean, you have art historians, you have historians, theologians, and I suspect, and you've alluded to this, you as a theologian learn a lot from an art historian if you're looking at the same text, and that is really important. And what I think is really exciting, particularly in this kind of post-pandemic or pandemic digital age, is that kind of collaborative work is easier now, right? It used to be you guys would have to travel to a conference and that kind of thing. And so hopefully the technology can be harnessed to allow that kind of interdisciplinary work to happen more naturally.
Absolutely. Yeah. We wrote this book during the pandemic. We studied 2019 with the fortress, with the handshake that let's make this happen. And the last piece came in this January. And galleys are in next week. So it was a pandemic love work.
Well, all the more impressive that you got it done through the pandemic. So thank you for that. Now, I'm looking at our clock and I want to turn. We've gotten a number of questions coming in from the audience. So I'm going to relay some of these. The first is perhaps a natural and obvious one, and I don't want to put you on the spot, but who's the most interesting woman you've encountered? So you got to give us your favorite and some stories of a favorite woman from the 16th century.
So unfair, because now I know more with thanks to these chapters. I know more of fascinating women, but closing my eyes, and my favorites are René of Ferrara, René of France, Olympia Marat, and Marie Dantier, and Catherine Giselle and our group. I can't, but I'm fascinated by Marie Dantier with her very explicitly feminist approach to reading scripture. And if I was more competent in French, I would probably spend a lot of time with Jeanne d'Albret, extremely brave women. but because I'm an Italophile, Olympia Morata is very close to my heart, and René Ferrara, they lived together in Ferrara in René's court, and both did some amazing, courageous things.
So a follow-up question to that, and this comes from someone who does some translation work, so I'm excited to hear this. Is there a woman whose work needs to be translated? Who's at the top of the list, particularly for English readers here, who it would really be great if their work were translated into English?
I think Chantal Brett and René of France, René Ferrara, would be very important to. We have translations of Olympia Morata, so that's, I would otherwise say that. But René of France, or she's from France, so you see her name in two ways: René of France or René Ferrara, and Chantal Brett. I think those would be very important to translate at this point in time. And whatever we can get from the Anabaptist women, the more information is coming in, extremely valuable. But these women, they were so persecuted, as were the Anabaptists in general, that we have harder time maybe finding written work on them. But yeah, those would be my top of my list.
Well, we've got our work cut out for us then. We got to get busy. So let me ask a question that came in, and you alluded to this. So the question, I'll just read it, is how do you understand the possibility of reconciliation between Protestant traditions and Roman Catholicism through the work of visualization of invisible figures? So does your work help with this ongoing task of reconciliation between these traditions?
I'm not sure. That's a big question. But what I'm saying is that what I can say is that studying the Reformation era women, the early modern women, is it's immediately ecumenical, because we don't study either side of women in vacuum. We want to have them in conversation. For instance, in our book, we have chapters on women who said absolutely no thank you to the Reformation, and we write about their stories and their voice, honoring their agency and their decision for their faith. And this is very exciting. What one of the biggest learnings for me was when I began to look at how Marie Dantier was committed in converting the nearby nuns in a convent, and utterly failed because the sisters in the convent had their own journey to follow, and they were not happily removed from the convent. And to see the women in the 16th century talking to one another, or fighting and say, no, this is my faith, that's yours, you're happy with your vocation, I'm happy with mine, let me be. And to see that gives us stimulus today to listen, to create those spaces where we can listen to one another and learn from one another, that how does your faith work for you? And we no longer keep hitting each other in the head because of our faith, right? We are more in a place, and especially in Berkeley, that's where we are in a room with Buddhist, Hindu, Muslim, Jew, Christian, different kind of. We don't have any space to say my faith is more important than yours. We start from the position of we work together, let's listen and learn from one another. And that kind of work allows us to also work ecumenically in places where it matters between different faith groups. Does that make sense?
It does make sense. I want to highlight again, you said that historical work is inherently conversational or interdenominational or ecumenical. I think that's absolutely right. Yeah. So I'm going to ask my final question, which is I always ask. We have an expert here with us, but for those of us who are not experts, can you recommend a book or two? Whether, obviously, we're going to all buy your book. There's no question about that. But if we want to learn a little bit more, whether it's about the Reformation broadly or about women in particular, what's on your reading list for us?
Okay, I wrote this down. So I'm looking at so I would recommend, first of all, there's a 3-volume work from Italy, Martin Luther, A Christian Between Reforms and Modernity, edited by Alberto Melloni. It is not only about Luther, it includes also chapters on women, and it is one of the most exciting books that came out, 3 volumes in 3 languages that came. I would read anything from Volker Lepin and Carter Lindbergh and Scott Hendricks in terms of general Reformation history and Luther. I do want to recommend the annotated Luther, which is 6 volumes, modern translations of Luther with inclusive annotations and introductions. And why I mentioned that is that even though it's annotated Luther, it gives you a lot of Reformation history in the annotations. Yeah. I want to recommend Amy Burnett Nelson's work on beyond Wittenberg, Marjorie Elizabeth Plummer's work on the convents, anything that Dr. McKee and Dr. Hemmick have written, they are just very stellar examples of how this work is done. And Mary Wisner Hanks's work on gender and women in 16th century is very this is fundamental work. And last but not least, when you buy the book or if you borrow, the bibliographies for each chapter will give you plenty of really good resources, and they are geared so that they are not so specific that that anybody couldn't just pick up and read.
Well, thank you. And I want to remind our guests that all of these sources will be compiled into a bibliography that we will email to you. So if you weren't able to write down all of those wonderful recommendations, don't worry, we will certainly get those to you. So Professor Stjerna, our time is drawing near. I want to thank you so much, not only for your time today, but of course for all of the work that you've been doing and will continue to do. We will certainly look for the book and be excited to learn more, as you've kind of alluded to here. I want to remind our guests that this is the third of a series, and I'm going to pull up a slide here. You can see that all of these recordings will be available to you online. You'll also be emailed with these, so you will not miss them. And these Kessler conversations have now been going on for 2 years, and we look forward to continuing the tradition in the fall. So please stay tuned and learn what topic we will take on in the fall. But for the most part, thank you, Professor Stjerna, for your time and your work. And thank you all for participating. And we look forward to seeing you soon.
Thank you very much. Have a great day.